Hello and welcome to today's healthitsecurity.com webcast sponsored by Cylance. The title of the webcast is The State of Medical Device Cybersecurity, Emerging Technologies for Staying Ahead of Risk. I am Fred Donovan, Senior Editor of Xtelligent Healthcare Media and moderator of today's presentation. Before moving on, I would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor. Cylance has redefined endpoint security. Its products and services predict and prevent rather than reactively detect the execution of advanced threats. Deployed on over 14.5 million endpoints, Cylance products and services protect clients worldwide, including Fortune 100 organizations and governments. We will begin the presentation with our featured speaker, followed by a question and answer period. Audience members can submit questions at any time during the webcast using the question tool to the left of their screens. For all technical matters or difficulties, click the Help icon at the top right-hand corner of the screen. A copy of the presentation slides is available under Event Resources to the left of your screens. A recording of the webcast will be made available following the presentation. Our speaker today is Greg Garcia, who is Executive Director for Cybersecurity at the Healthcare and Public Health Sector Coordinating Council. Garcia was appointed by President George W. Bush as the first Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security from 2006 to 2009, where he led the National Cybersecurity Division, the National Communications System, and the Office of Emergency Communications. After DHS, Greg went on to create and lead Bank of America's external partnership strategy for cybersecurity and identity management, and then headed the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, an industry partner to the government. He was appointed HSCC Cybersecurity Executive Director in October of 2017. With that, I would like to hand the floor over to Greg to begin his presentation. Greg?
Thank you, Fred. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you to Xtelligent Healthcare Media for inviting me to this webinar, and also to Cylance for sponsoring it. And I'm really pleased to be here. This is a particularly important time for the healthcare sector and cybersecurity. There is a lot going on. There's a lot coming up, and I'm eager to share it with you today. What I'd like to talk about first is to just set the context, a little bit about the state of cybersecurity in the healthcare industry, just a few statistics that many of us know, and then talk a little bit about what the Sector Coordinating Council is, its background and its mission. And then we'll get a little bit more specific to talk about medical device, medical technology, cybersecurity, and some of the related work that's going on in the Health Sector Council and in the industry as a whole. So first off, none of us wants to see this. We see error 404 on our computers all the time when we can no longer reach a particular website. But at the beginning and at the end of every shift, every design and production process of medical devices, every time we go into data entry and retrieval, this is what we're trying to avoid. So this is really topmost in the minds of healthcare industry executives who are looking out for cybersecurity, whether it's in medical devices or in clinical settings. The ultimate goal here is patient safety, where the mantra has become you can't have patient safety without cyber safety. So this is really what's driving us forward. And this has really been driven over the past year or so. Some of you may recognize this graphic. The Healthcare Industry Cybersecurity Task Force, which was required by the Congress and coordinated by HHS in a report that was delivered in June of 2017. And what they found, this was I'll talk more about the so-called HCIC task force report a little bit later, but it was about a couple of dozen executives, experts from healthcare industry in private sector and in government, and this is what they this was their diagnosis, that the cybersecurity healthcare is in critical condition for the reasons stated by that thermometer. And I would venture to say we're moving out of critical condition, perhaps maybe even into serious or stable condition, but maybe you will be the judge over time. But this is really what is driving the industry, the recognition of these key challenges, particularly a lack of security talent, and that's just not unique to the healthcare sector. Legacy equipment, of course, we have medical devices that have a lifetime of 20 years on up, and they were not designed or built with cybersecurity in mind, as this has become really cybersecurity. I think by most accounts has become a major challenge only in the past 5 to 7 years, where we have become such a large target, where we've traditionally thought of financial services as the big target. It's really now in the healthcare sector. So the rest of it you can see, connectivity of all our devices that impact patient care. And just an evolving and sophisticated threat landscape that is keeping us on our toes. And these are really the basic symptoms. I mean, there's many different ways we can describe the cybersecurity challenge, but I'm sure everybody on this webinar has experienced WannaCry or NotPetya in some form, but the National Health Service in the UK, MedStar, Hancock Health, pharmaceutical companies. There have been many victims of this, and we should expect only more in the future, as ransomware has become the attack du jour, and a particularly lucrative one. And this is just one of many threats we need to be paying attention to. So just by the numbers, again, you can read it, but AMA and Accenture did a very interesting study that the good news is it shows a lot of awareness across the healthcare sector, that 80% of the physicians know they have experienced the cyber attack, and they felt the downtime, and they've suffered the financial losses as a result of it. So really the first step to knowing you have a problem is to admit it and to recognize it. As the saying goes, there are two types of people: those who have been hacked, and those who are about to, and also those who have been hacked and don't know it. And it's those who don't know it that's the biggest threat to us, because it means we do not have visibility, and we are being blindsided. And the takeaway here that to this, to this scenario, to this threat landscape, is just this: cyber viruses should worry us as much as human viruses. As we get increasingly interlinked, our healthcare is increasingly interlinked with technology and wearable devices and Internet of Medical Things. We need to be looking at cybersecurity in a new light. So what are we doing about it? And who is responsible? Well, we all are. We're all responsible, and there is this organization called the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. And effectively what this is there are 16 critical industry sectors across our economy. They are called out in presidential executive order dating back to 1998, most recently updated in 2013. And it's a statement of government policy not a mandate or a regulation, but a recognition that there are 16 critical industry sectors that we all rely on for our national security, homeland security, economic security, public health and safety, and that those critical industry sectors are 85 to 90% of them are owned and operated by the private sector. And these industry sectors are facing all manner of threats every day, whether they are physical threats such as hurricanes, wildfires, terrorist bombs, active shooters, or cyber threats. And that it is up to us, the industry, primarily to organize ourselves around identifying those threats and developing collaborative ways that we can mitigate those threats. Collaborative in the sense that we are all interconnected. Within the health sector, there are 6 major subsectors. We all are interlinked in some way, interdependent in some way. It isn't enough that just one organization, one enterprise is doing the right thing to take care of its cybersecurity. It's that we have to recognize that we have systemic risk across the sector, and we are only as strong as the weakest link. So the Sector Coordinating Council, whether it's financial services, I served on that one. I helped stand up the Information Technology Sector Coordinating Council. There is communications, water, transportation, electricity. All of these have complexities within their sectors, and it requires an all-hands-on-deck effort by major stakeholders, major owners and operators within those industry sectors to consider what are the strategic and operational ways we can do better, that we can mitigate the risk and ensure a more secure and resilient sector. These executive orders that developed this structure called the National Infrastructure Protection Plan recognizes that there are 2 main ways that we mitigate these threats and deal with them. One of them is the ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, which are tactical, operational, real-time, blocking and tackling, watch, warning, incident response. And the flip side of that preparedness coin is the Sector Coordinating Council, which takes daily threats and attacks as a given, but we're asking ourselves, how do we get ahead of this? How do we prepare ourselves better so that these threats and attacks don't happen in the first place? What are the longer-term strategic and policy-oriented solutions that we can implement together as industry and in partnership with the government? And this planning process ultimately results in that third bullet there, a sector-specific plan. Every critical industry sector, every sector coordinating council produces in partnership with the government a sector-specific plan, which simply identifies the sector, what the threats are, what the vulnerabilities are, and what we're going to do about it, how we're going to work together to fix these vulnerabilities so that we're more secure and resilient. Those sector-specific plans are updated every 3 to 4 years to take account of new threats and technological innovations, new ways of doing business, and the healthcare sector is likely to be reviewing our sector plan for next year. This is the profile. So I mentioned we have 6 major subsectors within healthcare. This is the way it is parsed out: direct patient care, health IT and medical technology, that's the medical devices and electronic medical records. You've got the plans and players, which is mostly the insurance companies and the Blue Cross Blue Shield, pharmaceuticals, labs, and blood. Mass fatality management services are not one of the subsectors, is the only subsector we do not have represented on the cybersecurity working group, but they do participate in some of the broader physical security activities of the full sector council, and then medical materials. So this is the general profile of the Health Sector Coordinating Council. I am managing the day-to-day operations and strategy behind the cybersecurity working group. And this is the largest working group within the Sector Coordinating Council family. As you see, we are now at about 200 private sector organizational members with about 400 people representing them. This is a joint cybersecurity working group, so it does include experts, executives from HHS, from FDA, from the Department of Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, Defense Department, State Department, National Institute of Standards and Technology. The Cybersecurity Working Group had basically reorganized early this year after I came on, and we essentially looked at the healthcare industry cyber task force report as our target, as our reference point for what we need to be doing. This is a very well done report, very rigorously discussed by the members of that task force. They came out, and I'll describe that in a few slides down, but what came out of it was the creation of 13 task groups within the cyber working group. Actually, there are about 5 that were already pre-existing, standing groups like marketing and policy, but we organized task groups to deal with some of the very specific recommendations of the task force report, so that each task group had its own chair or co-chairs, members anywhere from 12 people to 50 people, with very specific deliverables and outcomes in their objectives, that they would develop what they would deliver on the objective that they set out for themselves, on the timeline that they set for themselves, with the likelihood that when the job is done, they will disband, or that they would look to doing a version 2.0 in the out years. But that's essentially how the Cybersecurity Working Group has been organized, and these are the task groups for 2018. We're coming to the end of 18, and we are beginning to think about what new initiatives we need to be taking on in 2019. And so we will be having a leadership meeting over the next few weeks to discuss that. But for today's discussion, I'll be talking in particular about the medical device security and management, and also the top 10 best practices, both on the left column there. Just quickly by the numbers, just to show, when I said at the start of the presentation, we may not be in critical condition anymore. Just these numbers alone suggest that there is both an awareness and energy behind the realization that we are behind on where we need to be in the healthcare sector as it pertains to cybersecurity. When I came on, we had about 60 organizational members, mostly in the direct patient care subsector, but now we're at about 200, 201. It fluctuates. Organizational members with, as you saw in the earlier slide, more than 400 people representing them. Advisors, that is, those are vendors and other security expert companies that can help us think through some of the more technical issues. And of course, we have association members. So they are, when you think about any industry association, and the Sector Coordinating Council is just that. The industry associations, the trade associations are particularly important because, of course, they represent a broad swath of a given subsector. So when you think of the Sector Coordinating Council, we are, in effect, an association of associations, and, of course, their member companies and member hospitals. And so it is our intent as an advisor to the government, we are a private sector organization advising and working with the government. We need to be able to say that we represent the broad consensus of the sector when we are putting forth recommendations or guidelines or white papers that describe a problem with solutions. It's the trade associations that have a particularly important role to ensure that they come to the table representing the broadest interests of their members. And of course, government is important because they bring to the table authorities and perspectives and responsibilities that the private sector does not have, and we bring to the table, of course, the same thing. We are the owners and operators. We have the real-time experience, and together we are able to think through in a non-regulatory way. Of course, we are a regulated industry, but we also recognize that regulation is not always the answer, that there's soft regulation and self-regulation, as it were, within the industry, and we need to be thinking creatively about what some of those solutions are. And just to give you a sense of when I say we need to represent the broadest cross-section of the industry sector as possible, this is our distribution right now in the cybersecurity working group, just in terms of the absolute numbers of representative organizations and their relative proportion, their percentage across the membership distribution. And again, this is just the cybersecurity working group. There's about another 100 organizations that are participating in some of the, for want of a better term, physical security issues, whether they've developed active shooter guidelines. There's an effort on supply chain resilience in the aftermath of such catastrophes as Hurricane Maria, trying to ensure that pharmaceuticals, drugs, essential equipment is able to get into a disaster area in time to save lives. So that's our distribution. So this is just an example of some of the things that we have produced over the course of the year, with more to come. We've spent on the policy side a fair amount of time responding to HHS requests for comment in two different areas, to CMS on Stark Law exception and to HHS Office of Inspector General. And for those not familiar with those, with the EHR reporting program or CMS, what we're trying to get across is really an echo of what the task force report had recommended, and that is that there's an anti-kickback law that prohibits any kind of assistance or technological donation to hospitals or clinical environments because it may be perceived as a quid pro quo in return for my service to you. I will get more business. But there's a clear recognition that given our interdependency, our interlinked nature across the risk environment, that small, mid-sized hospitals without the resources or expertise in cybersecurity can use the help of more sophisticated organizations, whether it's major companies that are selling them equipment or larger hospitals. And we have been calling for a cybersecurity carve-out, an exception to the Stark Law and anti-kickback, so that we actually can help those hospitals who need it in terms of cybersecurity. Because ultimately, again, cybersecurity is about patient safety. The third bullet here is what I'm going to be spending a little bit more time on in the next couple of slides. We will be releasing in the next couple of weeks the Medical Technology and Health IT Joint Security Plan, which is a roadmap for designing, developing, building security into medical devices, and also an impending publication in the next couple of weeks of the top 10 hospital cybersecurity best practices. This came out of Section 405D of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. I'll go into that a little bit more. But these are two very complementary sets of guidelines, and we're particularly excited about this, and we hope and we expect that it's going to move the needle. And just a couple of others, we're spending more time working with the Department of Homeland Security, of course, where I spent some time in terms of trying to gain a more systematic approach to how we assess risk across the healthcare sector, and particularly cybersecurity risk, and that will bear out. The National Risk Management Center, we will be working with DHS over time to, they will be helping us consider technological risk to the healthcare sector. Now, before I get into medical device security, I just wanted to drop this humorous little comic about medical device innovations. We hope it doesn't come to this, but I just throw that in for fun. This was particularly amusing and innovative way to think of medical devices that might not be operable at a given moment. But it does lead us to this recognition that hacking the computer can be now hacking the human. Again, this goes back to the previous takeaway that we need to be as concerned about computer viruses as human viruses. We just keep pounding this mantra in because I think that the healthcare industry is not unique when you think of people across other sectors, and they are operational people, or they are executive people in the C-suite, in marketing, and anywhere else. And when you say cybersecurity to them, they say, well, that's the IT guy's problem. That's the IT department's problem. It's not my problem. And that's just incorrect and dangerous. It is everybody's problem because we all touch technology, we all touch data, and we all in the hospital sector, we're touching humans. And so when those two, technology and humans, interact, we have a new risk introduced. So cybersecurity is not just the IT department's problem. It belongs to hospitals and clinicians and nurses and pharmacists and medical device manufacturers. This is the healthcare industry task force that I was talking about. And I trust most of you have had at least a cursory look at it. But this really was our bullseye. This was our target for the cybersecurity working group. And that is, these were the 6 major imperatives identified in the task force. And under each one of those 6 imperatives was a cascade of so-called recommendations. And under those recommendations was another cascade of action items. Last count, there were 105 action items that were impressed upon the healthcare sector to deal with cybersecurity. But bringing your attention to imperative number 2, given the focus of this particular webinar, increase the security and resilience of medical devices and health IT. And sort of partnering with that is imperative number 4, which really speaks to the Section 405D hospital best practices, increasing healthcare readiness through improved cybersecurity awareness and education. So that's what this particular, all of those 6 imperatives are addressed in the Health Sector Coordinating Council Cybersecurity Working Group. But for today's presentation, we're just going to focus on numbers 2 and 1. And so this is what we will be releasing over the next couple of weeks. And I'll give you a little bit of background on that. As many of you know, there has been no shortage of friction over the past few years between hospital systems and the medical technology community. In fact, it was a bit of a circular finger-pointing exercise where the hospital systems would suffer a breach, perhaps because of a medical device failure or a medical device breach, and they would complain that the medical device manufacturers had not built security in, had not patched it for them. And the medical device manufacturers say, but understand that we have product life cycles that 5, 10, 15 years, we were never presented with the concerns about cybersecurity. And furthermore, we have some restrictions on how we can patch products that you have bought, there are regulatory issues that go with that, and there are governance issues within the hospitals. So for a time there wasn't much progress being made. And last summer, a few medical device companies got together and said, all right, we have to change this paradigm. The task force report is correct. We need to step up our game on medical device security. Let's develop some guidelines for what all medical device manufacturers ought to hold themselves accountable for the design, development, and manufacture of cybersecurity into our products, dealing with patch management, vulnerability disclosure, and end-of-supported lifetimes of our products, and to do this with some transparency for our customers and for patient safety. And thus was born this effort in response to imperative number 2, to develop a set of guidelines that are voluntary, that are consensus-based, and that should evolve over time with advances in technology and governance. But I won't read those bullets down to you, but it's basically it's a full product lifecycle end-to-end set of guidelines, loosely aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which of course was released in 2014 and has been itself evolving over time. The participants, it's very important to note that this was a joint effort that was co-chaired by not just a medical device manufacturer, Becton Dickinson, but also the Mayo Clinic as a major healthcare provider, and FDA. So this was a tripartite leadership of this task group, which rolled up its efforts under the Sector Coordinating Council. And it was an iterative process that started with medical device manufacturers and health IT vendors and moved on to healthcare providers and their trade associations and others to be sure that what we are proposing is something that is understood and practicable by all concerned. As I've mentioned, this is based on the imperative number 2, and it's mapped to the NIST framework. This is really a repeat of the previous slide. That what we have to focus on in the Sector Coordinating Council is process. That if we are going to present anything as an industry recommendation, it needs to undergo the integrity of process. And we have a governance process that establishes our leadership and our product approval process by consensus or majority vote. And we provide all the essential review time necessary and feedback so that what we are presenting is our best thinking on the matter. And it's never going to make everybody happy, and it's never going to be perfect. But the process is key so that everybody gets an opportunity to provide their input so that we can then take it to the next step and actually implement it and encourage and urge major medical device companies and smaller to mid-sized medical device companies to try to integrate these guidelines into their product development, product security process, so that over the next few years, we may be able to actually measure not just adoption, but improvement in various security measures for medical devices and how they're being deployed and managed by their hospital customers. And that brings us to this second major release that's coming out, the Section 405D Top 10 Cybersecurity Best Practices. This this lays out, as you will see here. Well, let me give it some background. The 405D, again, effort was the result of a congressional measure in the Cybersecurity Act. Section 405C is what created the task force, the Healthcare Industry Cyber Task Force. Section 405D, which followed it, says, and by the way, hospital systems need to be better prepared and resilient in cybersecurity, and HHS will be responsible for leading an effort to come up with what are the best practices for hospitals that are really specific to the healthcare industry. What came out of that was the appointment of about 150 people within the medical profession and information security profession to bring their best thinking to what cybersecurity practices rise to the top for hospitals in a way that's scalable, in a way that the small 20-bed hospital, in rural Alabama can implement in the same cost-effective way as a national level healthcare hospital corporation of America or Mayo Clinic. And it's pegged to the identification of 5 key threats. And I think there's a significant amount of time spent you see on that clipboard on the right, the 5 current threats. Many reasonable minds will disagree on what are the most pernicious threats that we face in cybersecurity. These are the 5 that they settled on. And in order to address those 5 major threats, they came up with 10 best practices that are organized, as you see in the left column there, with technical volume 1 and technical volume 2 as sort of a tiered approach to dealing with cybersecurity practices from the perspective of a small and less technical organization to medium and large organizations that are more sophisticated and can bring a higher level of granularity and quite frankly a higher level of investment into their cyber operations. That's a little bit small. I think you should all be able to read it. These are the top 10 practices according to major categories: email protection, endpoint protection, access management, data protection and loss prevention, asset management, network management, vulnerability, incident response, medical device security, and cybersecurity policies. This is really, this is going to be, we hope, implemented across the healthcare industry, the hospital industry, small, medium, and large. These practices have already been beta tested, if you will. The tires have been kicked, pre-tested by more than 100 hospital systems across the country in all the major regions of the country. This beta testing process took place in the spring and the summer. All feedback that was returned from that beta testing was in turn fed back into a refinement of these best practices. This will be a living document over time as we are better informed by how it is being implemented. We will continue to refine it with the help of HHS and the industry. And by the way, this effort was co-chaired by Eric Decker, the Chief Information Security Officer for University of Chicago Medical Center, and Julie Chua from HHS Office of the CIO. But I want to bring your attention just briefly, and I'm going to close in the next couple of minutes, to practice number 9, medical device security. So this, as you recall, I mentioned that there had been a lot of circular finger pointing, a lot of friction between the medical device community and the hospital community. What this Section 9 describes is what is it that a hospital system needs to understand in terms of dealing with your medical device vendors. What is it that, how do you best procure devices with cybersecurity in mind, whether it's writing a contract, doing any technical assessments and security assessments, penetration testing, but what should you expect from your medical device vendors? And in Section 9, it will point the reader, it will point the hospital to the Joint Security Plan. So it will say for a reference for how medical device companies will be managing contracts with you, see the Joint Security Plan. Among other things, you should be asking for a software bill of materials. What's in the product that I've just bought? And if you go to the Joint Security Plan, the Joint Security Plan will say you should be offering to your hospital a Joint Security Plan. And so, and that's just one example. And it will say go to the top 10 best practices to understand what hospital systems will be expecting of us, the medical device community. So in this way, these two major work products are cross-referencing one another. And that really brings home the point, the recognition, the evolution of these relationships within the sector council, within the healthcare industry, that cybersecurity is indeed, in fact, a shared challenge. It's not blame one or blame the other. It is a shared challenge, and therefore it's a shared responsibility. And just as the mantra is cybersecurity is about patient safety, cybersecurity is also a shared responsibility. So I think that level of maturity is happening now in the healthcare sector, and I think we are moving out of critical condition into something that I think is going to make us healthier all the way around. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, and I'm happy to open it up for questions. But again, I think we are on the upswing here. The one thing to keep in mind is in any cybersecurity endeavors, whether it's been in my time in financial services or healthcare, information technology or communications, we are never done. We are only better. And I think we are getting better in healthcare. For those of you who are in the healthcare industry and are not participating in the Sector Coordinating Council, please do contact me at these coordinates. We have a lot of work to do, and we're constantly encouraging more leadership, new leadership. It's currently chaired by the Cyber Working Group is currently co-chaired by Terry Rice, the Global Chief Information Security Officer for Merck, and also Brian Klein, Vice President of Standards at HITrust. We have a lot of work to do. So I hope to see some of you joining the group. And I'll end there and open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Greg, for that excellent presentation. I appreciate it. We will now move on to the Q&A portion of the webcast. Audience members can submit questions using the question tool to the left of your screen. We have lots of questions already, so I don't know if we'll be able to get to them all, but we'll try. So the first question for you, Greg, is this person is interested in your opinion regarding a Microsoft.NET feature pack requirement for medical devices. We typically hear from vendors stating that the need to back level these versions to FDA certification requirements. Do you have any opinion on that?
I don't. That is a particularly technical and operational question that I myself, being more involved on the policy side and management side, would not have visibility into. But I certainly have heard any number of occasions where, not necessarily Microsoft.NET, but where a lot of medical devices are still operating Windows XP, and how do you deal with the patching of that. And in terms of FDA approval, I've heard FDA try to debunk the assertion made a number of times that when you have to go in to patch a medical device that does not require a resubmission to FDA for clearance, if it isn't changing the fundamental functionality of the product. A simple cybersecurity patch would not in itself require a resubmission to FDA. I don't know if that's answering the question, but bottom line is I don't have any knowledge or experience to answer that accurately.
All right. Well, the next question is, with the deployment of AI strategies in healthcare, particularly in radiology departments with medical imaging, what do companies and healthcare facilities need to think about with the development and implementation of their AI solutions?
That's a great question, and I will tell you, we just got out of a meeting with HHS this morning where that question came up, and the question will be answered with another question, and that is, that's going to be one of our objectives for 2019. We have a task group called Future Gazing, if any of you caught that earlier in the slide deck. Future Gazing is looking at questions just like that, not just about AI, but about quantum cryptography or developments in telemedicine, Internet of Medical Things. Excuse me. The future gazing work is asking those questions. That is, what are the emerging technologies that are being deployed for medical, for healthcare, whether it's medical devices or health IT or whatever else, that will present either opportunities for risk mitigation or present new risk threats. We are going to be asking that question in a methodical way next year through this task group, but also at the invitation of the Department of Homeland Security and the National Risk Management Center. We may be undertaking a partnered effort there to assess those kinds of technology risks to the healthcare sector, including AI. So the answer to that question is to be determined. Stay tuned, and if you have perspectives on this, then I absolutely encourage you, the questioner, to participate in our efforts.
Okay. All right. Now, I think the next question is referring to a statistic that you gave on the slide, one of your slides. It says 80% of physicians have been attacked. Does this percentage represent a cyber attack at work, or personal, or both?
That, yeah, I do not know that. I'm assuming it is in the at work, whether it's in the small doctor's office or in the hospital setting or the clinical setting. This was a survey done collaboratively by American Medical Association and Accenture. I'm sure if you Google that survey, you can download it and read the methodology.
All right. The next question says, I noticed that medical device manufacturers weren't listed in the distribution. I'm not sure what that's referring to, but perhaps you do.
Maybe referring to the distribution of the membership, but they are the medical device community, medical technology community. They if you can see the slide deck, I moved it up. Medical materials is what that subsector is, as distinct from health IT. So they are in our membership. We have the major players are Becton Dickinson, Philips, Siemens, GE Healthcare, a few others are in the membership, as is the major trade associations, AdvaMed, Medical Device Manufacturers Association, Medical Imaging Technology Association. So the medical technology subsector is very well represented in in the Sector Coordinating Council.
Okay. The next question is, shouldn't cybersecurity be patient safety? Cybersecurity vulnerabilities could be exploited to cause patient harm.
Absolutely. That is our mantra. Thank you for asking that question. I mean, that is what we are trying to get across. As I mentioned, over the past year, I've spent a lot of time meeting with individuals in hospitals, nurses, and doctors, and there really is only the emerging recognition that they actually have some responsibility for cybersecurity because they are touching the patients. They are touching the technology and the health IT and the electronic records. And it is their responsibility as the frontline healthcare providers to understand that if they make mistakes in the management of technology or the management of data, this can create patient harm. The good news is, so far, there has not been any reports of catastrophic events where a cyber attack resulted in patient harm. One of the victims of the ransomware attack last year that affected so many hospitals in the UK, Hancock Healthcare in Indiana, the CEO actually gave a very interesting presentation to the Health ISAC last spring that walked through what happened when they got that ransomware attack, and all of their computer systems were shut down. That meant medical devices were shut down that were connected to the network. That means appointment systems, patient records, health records, anything that had to do with previous treatments and medical regimens that they had, all were inaccessible. They had to revert over a weekend of operations to an entirely paper-based system. Fortunately, nobody was hurt or died or got worse. I think in one report, one patient had to be moved to another hospital, but that was managed. But yes, you can't have patient safety now without cybersecurity.
All right. And how can non-members keep track of the work product of the council, including issuance of medical technology, joint security plan, and top 10 cybersecurity best practices?
Great question. Everything will be on our website. Draft documents remain draft and therefore not for public consumption. But when they are released, again, in these two major products that I was talking about, they will be released in the next couple of weeks and will appear not only on our website, healthsectorcouncil.org, but also on the FDA website, on HHS website, the Office of Critical Infrastructure Protection. If you go to phe.gov, it will be posted there. And then we will also prevail on many of our member organizations, particularly the trade associations. It's going to be a lot of the trade associations' role to not just post a best practice onto their website, and there it sits. This will not become shelfware. We will be embarking on a proactive and assertive marketing campaign to build awareness, to drive adoption, and ultimately to measure implementation. So you'll be hearing about it. I certainly hope. But to read it, to download it, to assess whether you can internalize it and implement it within your organization, that will be available to you in the next couple of weeks.
All right. And let's see, I got bumped up here. I want to go in order. Is HIPAA outdated, or do we need to follow its rules while working on cybersecurity nowadays? Have there been any updates to HIPAA that I need to worry about?
I think everybody agrees HIPAA is outdated, including the people who wrote it into law. In particular, one of the elements that I mentioned as it pertains to cybersecurity is the anti-kickback, and the recognition that we are interconnected and we have interdependencies in cybersecurity, and we should be able to help each other for the benefit of patient safety. So now HIPAA prohibits that, and the Stark Law and the various anti-kickback regulations. I'm myself learning about the healthcare sector. I've been at it for just 1 year, and so the complexities of HIPAA are many, but by all accounts, it's outdated. It was developed before we had this technological explosion and electronic health records that are ubiquitous, not just in the provider's care, but also in the hands of the patients. So it does need to be modernized, and I'm sure there's a whole week's worth of webinars to go through every area where it can be modernized.
Okay, and is there any threat vulnerability database specific to medical devices?
That's a good question. I do not think so. I think we are starting in on that process because the complexity is that there are threats and vulnerabilities that affect medical devices, but not medical devices uniquely. The FDA has been pretty proactive in trying to build out that level of awareness. It's developed a memorandum of understanding with the ISAC and the MED. The Medical ISAL, Information Sharing and Analysis Organization, and SATO, another medical device ISAL, so that over time, as we share more information about threats and vulnerabilities, either that are unique to the medical devices or just affect medical devices, among many other technologies, that we can, cross-check that with other threat and vulnerability databases that are administered by NIST, for example, CVSS, and others. So there's and at the same time, you've got the Department of Homeland Security's ICS cert, Industrial Control Systems cert, which collects some of that data, and the newly reincarnated HC3, which was the HHS, which was called the Healthcare Cybersecurity Integration Center. They in turn will be collecting more information about that as well. But I don't think there is just yet a central database of medical device vulnerabilities.
Okay. Well, I think we have time for one more question. I think I'll reach down a little down the list here. How do you suggest that a CISO influence the board to make a higher priority of data and cyber protection?
That's a great question. It has to be made clear to the board. Most boards have a risk committee. Most boards of directors have risk committee. It's just that cybersecurity risk has not uniformly entered the lexicon or the operational attention of boards of directors. So that it's necessary to make clear that cybersecurity is really about securing data and operations, and therefore business continuity. And if it is preventing bad things from happening, if it's preventing the loss of data, and if it's preventing the disruption of operations, it is therefore enabling those operations. So cybersecurity is an enabler of business operations. I think that it has to be one of the more compelling arguments for any board of directors, that if you want business to continue and to continue making money, then you better invest in cybersecurity, just as you invest in mitigating other risks, other external risks. But I really respect that question, because it is one that many CISOs do have a hard time answering and do have a hard time convincing their board. There is a couple of good resources. The Internet Security Alliance, if you look them up, has put out a couple of versions of something like the top 10 questions the CEO should be asking. The NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD, they also have a resource for how cybersecurity needs to be articulated at the board of directors level, so that you can get the investment and get the respect that you deserve. So check out those two, National Association of Corporate Directors and the Internet Security Alliance. They have tools that I think do a very good job of simplifying the message, really, to your board.
Great. Well, that concludes today's webcast. A special thanks to our speaker, Greg Garcia, our audience, and our sponsor, Cylance. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.